Have you ever noticed how some people listen, not to understand, but to find where you went wrong? You're halfway through sharing something close to your heart. A small victory, a mistake, a dream, and before your words even settle, they're already dissecting them. They tilt their head, smirk slightly, and deliver their verdict wrapped in a phrase that feels harmless. I'm just being honest. But you can feel it, that quiet sting under the surface. It's not advice. It's judgment disguised as care. There's a strange loneliness that comes from being around someone who always finds a flaw in you. You start speaking less, shrinking your thoughts, filtering your joy, until you learn to edit yourself before they ever get the chance to. And what's worse, you start believing them. You start thinking that maybe they're right. Maybe you are too sensitive, too dramatic, too imperfect to be loved without correction. The truth is, judgment rarely starts as cruelty. It starts as insecurity. It's the language of people who once felt powerless, who now grasp at superiority as their shield. Somewhere in their past, they were made to feel small, and so they learned that the only way to avoid being judged is to stay one step ahead to judge first. Like a mirror turned outward, they reflect their own fears onto everyone else. Psychologists call this projection a defense mechanism, where you cast out the traits you can't bear to see in yourself. A person who hates weakness calls others weak. A person terrified of failure mocks the failures of others. It's not about you, it's about the parts of them they can't face. But when you're on the receiving end, that distinction doesn't soften the wound. Their tone still cuts through you. Their words still echo in your head long after they've forgotten them. Judgment doesn't just wound your confidence, it reshapes your identity. You begin to associate love with correction, connection, with performance. You learn to survive by pleasing, proving, or hiding anything but simply being. Maybe that's why it hurts most when it comes from a friend. Because you didn't sign up to be graded, you signed up to be seen. And when they keep holding up that invisible scorecard, you start to realize they never saw you at all. They only saw a reflection of their own standards, their own pain. Yet, there's a deeper truth hiding beneath their criticism, one that most never see. Those who fear being judged often become the harshest judges themselves. Their cruelty is not confidence, it's camouflage. Their need to correct is a quiet plea to feel in control of a world that once made them feel helpless. And so you sit there, trying to understand why someone you care about keeps cutting you down, when all you ever wanted was connection. But every harsh word, every backhanded truth, every small critique, it's all part of a pattern that began long before they met you, because no one becomes judgmental by accident. It's a habit learned in the echo of fear, a shadow passed down from their own childhood silence. And, to truly understand them, you'll have to look there first. To understand the judgmental friend, you must return to where that voice was first born, in a childhood where love was measured, not given. It always begins quietly, long before you realize it's happening. A child sits at the kitchen table, holding up a drawing, a grade, a story, hoping for a smile. Instead, they're met with a sigh, a correction, or a comparison. You could have done better. Why can't you be more like them? It's a moment so small it looks harmless from the outside. But inside that child's mind, something begins to shift. Love stops feeling safe. Acceptance starts to feel earned. And the earliest seeds of judgment, not against others, but against the self, are planted. When love feels conditional, the heart adapts. You learn that safety depends on performance. You become hyper-aware of tone, expression, approval. You start anticipating criticism before it arrives, reading micro-expressions like weather forecasts for affection. And somewhere along the way, you make an unspoken vow: I'll judge myself before anyone else can. It feels protective, even smart, but it's a trap, because once the inner critic wakes up, it never stops talking. Psychologists call this internalized shame. It's the moment a child stops seeing mistakes as events and starts seeing them as proof of unworthiness. Each disapproving glance becomes a mirror, each scolding a law carved into the psyche. You are only as good as your last success. Neuroscience shows that these early emotional experiences wire the brain for survival, not peace. The amygdala, the brain's alarm system, becomes hypersensitive, firing at the slightest hint of rejection. And so, judgment becomes a shield. Before someone else can make you feel small, you'll shrink the world down to your own rules. You'll measure, critique, dissect anything to stay in control of the chaos. You can see it later in life, the perfectionist who can't rest until everything feels safe, the adult who mistakes control for love, the friend who criticizes because that's how they learn to care. They aren't trying to hurt you, they're reliving an ancient fear that if they don't fix everything, they'll lose everything. That fear runs deep. It's not arrogance. It's the shadow of a child who once needed to be perfect just to be held. And yet, that same child, now grown, still carries the voice that once protected them. They've learned to wear judgment like armor, polished, heavy, convincing. But the tragedy is, armor doesn't just keep pain out, it keeps love out too. Because when you're constantly scanning for flaws, you can't see beauty. When you're always defending, you forget how to receive. If you look closely, you'll realize behind every judgmental person is a child who never felt good enough. Their criticism isn't cruelty, it's a cry that was never answered. If you've ever been made to feel small by someone who calls it honesty, don't move, because by the end, I'll show you the truth behind why they do it and how to stop giving them that power. Because before that inner judge ever turned outward, it lived inside. And to understand why your friend criticizes, you must first see how they learned to survive their own. It's strange how judgment wears such convincing disguises. It walks into the room dressed as honesty, draped in the language of high standards, or cloaked behind phrases like, "I'm just saying what everyone's thinking." It smiles, it jokes, it pretends to care. But beneath that mask, it's trembling. Because judgment is never born from peace, it's born from fear. The fear of being seen as small, flawed, or forgettable. The fear that if you don't keep your guard up, someone will expose the cracks you've spent your whole life trying to hide. As you grow older, that fear becomes subtle, sophisticated even. You start calling it truth. You begin to equate criticism with clarity, detachment with intelligence, and harshness with strength. But what you're really doing is building a fortress of control. Judgment becomes your armor. Every time you mock someone's failure, you momentarily silence the part of yourself that's terrified of failing. Every time you roll your eyes at someone's dream, you quiet the voice that whispers that you'll never have the courage to chase your own. Judgment is the ego's way of saying, if I can define the world, maybe it can't hurt me. You've probably seen it, that friend who scoffs at someone's happiness, who insists they're just realistic. The one who points out every flaw in someone's work, but never dares to show their own. They wear confidence like armor, but if you listen closely, their words carry a tremor, because judgment, at its core, isn't power, it's protection. It's what people use when vulnerability feels too dangerous. Neuroscience offers a clue. When the brain senses threat, even social threat, like embarrassment or rejection, the same survival circuits activate as if facing physical danger. Judgment gives the illusion of safety. It keeps the spotlight away from your wounds. Psychologically, this is projection, the act of disowning your insecurities by placing them on others. You see laziness, arrogance, weakness in everyone around you because it's easier than admitting you fear those things in yourself. It's the shadow Jung spoke of, the part of you that you hide, only to see it mirrored back in the people you critique. But this defense comes at a cost. You become emotionally distant. Connection feels threatening. Empathy feels exposing. You start analyzing people instead of feeling them. turning every interaction into a quiet competition for control. What began as protection becomes isolation, because when you judge others, you teach yourself to fear your own humanity, and nothing is lonelier than that. So the mask stays on, polished, reasonable, composed. But beneath it, the same old child is still whispering, "Please don't find out I'm not enough." And the more you hide that voice, the louder it grows, pushing you to judge harder, speak colder, and smile less, because judgment isn't confidence, it's the ego's anxious whisper trying to stay safe. And to truly understand it, we must look at what's happening inside the mind itself, the science, the shadow, and the fragile architecture of control that keeps it alive. The human mind is a master of disguise. It knows how to turn pain into power, fear into control, and shame into judgment. When you judge someone, it doesn't always come from cruelty. It often comes from self-preservation. The truth is, your brain is simply trying to protect you from yourself. It's a quiet biological defense, dressed up as morality. Freud called it projection, the unconscious act of rejecting parts of yourself that you cannot tolerate and placing them onto others. If you grew up believing certain emotions were wrong, anger, envy, neediness, or fear, you didn't stop feeling them. You just learned to exile them into the dark corners of your psyche. Carl Jung called this the shadow self, the collection of your denied qualities, the traits you've buried to appear acceptable, good, or in control. And because the mind cannot destroy what it refuses to face, it pushes it outward. You start seeing in others what you most dislike in yourself. Their flaws trigger you, their confidence threatens you, their mistakes disgust you not because they're wrong, but because they remind you of your own hidden chaos. Neuroscience gives this shadow a modern shape. Studies on the brain's default mode network, the system active during self-reflection, show that when your sense of self is threatened, the brain quickly redirects focus outward. It's easier to analyze, critique, or condemn than to confront the anxiety of imperfection within. Judgment, therefore, becomes emotional regulation. When shame lights a fire inside, judgment extinguishes it for a moment, but only by turning the flame onto someone else. Brené Brown's research on shame resilience reveals that judgment offers a false sense of relief. It's the mind's way of saying, "At least I'm not like them." That comparison releases a small hit of dopamine, the same chemical that rewards survival. But it's fleeting, because as soon as the judgment fades, the self-doubt returns. It's an addiction to temporary superiority that feeds long-term emptiness. And here lies the paradox. The more you judge others, the more you reinforce your own inner critic. Every insult you cast at someone else strengthens the neural pathways of self-judgment. Over time, you become both the accuser and the accused, trapped in a silent trial that never ends. You think you're defending yourself, but you're only deepening the wound. The mind, in its attempt to protect, becomes its own prison. It confuses vigilance with wisdom, critique with control, and ends up mistaking disconnection for safety. But beneath all the psychology and neuroscience, the truth remains heartbreakingly human. People judge because they're afraid of being seen. They hide their flaws by magnifying yours. So the next time someone criticizes you with certainty, remember you're witnessing their shadow speaking, a part of them they cannot bear to face. And perhaps, in your moments of judgment, you're doing the same, because judgment, at its core, is not strength. It's fear dressed as moral clarity. And when that fear grows unchecked, it begins to darken everything it touches. The next part reveals how that quiet defense turns into something far more haunting, the cruelty that hides behind kindness. It never begins with shouting. Judgment rarely needs to raise its voice. It seeps in through the smallest cracks: a sigh, a smirk, a question asked just sharply enough to make you doubt yourself. You really think that's a good idea? You're too sensitive. I'm just trying to help. It sounds harmless, even caring, but that's what makes it so devastating. Because this kind of cruelty doesn't tear you apart all at once. It starves you slowly. You start noticing it in the silence after you share something vulnerable, the slight delay before they respond, as if measuring whether your joy deserves approval. You begin shrinking without realizing it. You edit your sentences midway, soften your tone, avoid topics that might invite their disapproval. Eventually, you stop showing parts of yourself altogether. And that's when judgment wins, not because it's loud, but because it teaches you to police yourself. Psychologists call this learned shame. Over time, your nervous system begins to anticipate criticism, even when it isn't there. The body goes into quiet defense, the heart rate rises, the breath shortens, as if emotional rejection were physical danger. Neuroscience shows that social pain activates the same regions of the brain as physical pain. The mind can't tell the difference between being hit and being humiliated. So every joke, every sarcastic remark, every disguised insult leaves behind an invisible bruise. But here's the haunting twist: the judgmental friend isn't free either. Their cruelty is their cage. Behind the calm tone and controlled demeanor lives someone terrified of imperfection. They cannot relax, because their self-worth depends on being right, on being the one who sees the flaw before anyone else does. They hover like gardeners obsessed with pruning every leaf, unable to notice that the garden is dying. Perfectionism becomes their prison, and the fear of being ordinary becomes the lock. Carl Jung once said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." Judgment is that unconscious force, the shadow speaking through kindness, the cruelty that believes it's saving someone by cutting them down. It's how people destroy intimacy while believing they're protecting truth. And slowly, both the judge and the judged lose something vital: trust. The judged stops trusting themselves, and the judge stops trusting love. Because love requires acceptance, and judgment cannot coexist with that. Love says, "You're safe as you are." Judgment says, "You're almost enough." And almost becomes the wound that never heals. So you sit across from your friend, smiling politely as they dissect your choices, unaware that beneath the table your hands are clenched. You pretend it doesn't hurt, and they pretend it's care. But deep down, both of you know this isn't connection, it's control dressed as concern. And yet, this quiet cruelty doesn't exist in a vacuum. The world rewards it, praises the critic, uplifts the cynic, and mistakes judgment for intelligence. To see how deeply this runs, you have to step back and look at the society that taught us to value critique more than compassion. We live in a world that quietly worships judgment. You can see it everywhere in the way people talk, the way they scroll, the way they compare. Entire economies now run on opinion. Influencers build empires on outrage. Corporations reward critical thinking. But what they often mean is, who can find the flaw fastest? We've built a culture that mistakes cynicism for intelligence, detachment for wisdom, and harshness for truth. And the cost of that belief system is empathy, quietly fading in the background like an old song no one listens to anymore. From a young age, you're taught to evaluate before you understand. School trains you to grade, not to grasp. Social media teaches you to rate before you reflect. And soon, you start viewing the world not as something to experience, but as something to assess. You judge art, people, choices, and eventually, yourself. What began as a survival skill in a world of constant feedback becomes a reflex. You measure worth in likes, validation in applause, and power in who you can outsmart or outshame. But judgment is a double-edged mirror. Every time you hold it up to someone else, you're forced to see yourself within it. Neuroscience suggests that the same neural circuits used for evaluating others are also active when we evaluate ourselves. It's why those who judge harshly often carry a deeper self-critique. The mind doesn't know how to separate the two. When you habitually analyze and compare, your inner voice begins to sound like the collective voice of society, sharp, demanding, and never satisfied. In this cultural storm, empathy is mistaken for weakness. To be compassionate is to risk being naive. To forgive is to appear foolish. So people armor up. They use intellect as a shield, irony as a mask, and judgment as a sword. You see it in the language of realism, in the casual cruelty of online comment sections, in the quiet satisfaction of watching someone fail. Society doesn't just allow judgment, it feeds on it. Because in a world obsessed with status and scarcity, finding fault in others feels like proof that you're still above water. And yet, beneath that illusion of control, there's exhaustion. No one can keep performing superiority forever. Behind every critic is a human being craving connection. But connection requires vulnerability, and vulnerability terrifies those who've built their identity on appearing flawless. So, we build walls of intellect, sarcasm, and standards until there's no air left to breathe. It's a paradox. The more we judge, the less we understand. The more we analyze, the less we feel. And the more we compete, the less we connect. Judgment may make you feel smart for a moment, but it quietly robs you of wonder. Because when a culture teaches you to see life through the lens of comparison, it's not just the world you misjudge, it's yourself. And over time, that habit doesn't just shape your opinions, it reshapes your soul. The next part explores the invisible cost of living. That way, the loneliness that hides behind every perfect critique. There comes a point when the mask starts to feel heavier than the face beneath it. You can see it in the subtle exhaustion that lingers after every sharp remark, in the quiet that follows every conversation where someone had to be corrected. Judgment promises control, but it delivers isolation. It tells you that if you stay above others, you'll never be hurt again. But what it doesn't tell you is that the air up there is thin, cold, and lonely. You might know the feeling yourself, scrolling through endless images of people living lives that look freer, happier, more beautiful than yours. You don't even mean to compare, but you do. You find a flaw here, a mistake there, just enough to dull the ache of envy that flickers in your chest. For a moment, it helps. Critique becomes comfort. But then the screen goes dark, and you're left with the same hollow stillness, realizing that the only person you've distanced is yourself. Psychologists call it evaluation fatigue, the mental exhaustion that comes from constant comparison. The human brain wasn't built to measure everything. When you're in a state of judgment, your neural circuits for empathy shut down. The prefrontal cortex responsible for understanding others dims, while the amygdala, the fear center, lights up. In other words, judgment doesn't make you powerful. It keeps you in survival mode, scanning for danger even when there isn't any. You begin to live not through connection, but through defense. And if you've ever been on the other side, the one who's judged, you know the quiet damage it causes. The words may fade, but the tension doesn't. You start overthinking your tone, your body language, your choices. You replay interactions in your head, trying to decode what you did wrong. The nervous system learns to expect disapproval like clockwork. Over time, you stop expressing joy or vulnerability because nothing feels safe anymore. What was once friendship begins to feel like walking through glass barefoot, careful not to bleed. But here's the irony. Both the critic and the criticized end up trapped in the same loneliness. One hides behind the armor of superiority, terrified of exposure. The other hides behind silence, terrified of rejection. Both wear masks. Both ache for closeness, but don't know how to reach it anymore. Beneath every judgmental person is an unmet need for belonging, and beneath every person judged is a fading hope that they'll ever be understood. Carl Jung believed that what you judge most harshly in others is the part of yourself you've abandoned. And maybe that's the saddest part. Judgment doesn't separate good from bad, it separates the heart from itself. Because the more you point fingers outward, the less you can feel inward. And yet, it doesn't have to stay that way. Because even the harshest inner critic can learn softness if you know how to face it. The next part reveals what it actually takes to break free from the cycle. not by silencing judgment, but by transforming it into understanding. There comes a moment when you finally grow tired of the noise in your own head, that quiet, relentless voice that points, compares, critiques, and condemns. You realize judgment hasn't made you wiser or safer. It's only made the world smaller, colder, lonelier. And so you begin to ask a different question. What if the opposite of judgment isn't approval, but understanding? Understanding doesn't mean you excuse the flaws of others. It doesn't mean you silence your standards or pretend that harm doesn't exist. It means you pause just long enough to ask, what pain might be behind this? It's the smallest space in the mind, yet it changes everything, because in that breath you stop reacting from fear and start responding from awareness. Carl Rogers called this unconditional positive regard, the practice of seeing another human being without immediately turning them into a problem to solve. It's not naive optimism, it's radical empathy. Neuroscience shows that when you soften your judgments, your brain shifts from the threat-based amygdala to the prefrontal cortex, the part responsible for perspective, logic, and compassion. You literally move from survival to consciousness. Understanding is not an emotion, it's a higher state of perception, and that begins with yourself. Kristin Neff's research on self-compassion reveals that people who judge others harshly almost always direct that same blade inward. They carry impossible standards for themselves, born from years of conditional love. Self-compassion doesn't make you weak, it makes you human again. It's the quiet act of saying, I'm learning, instead of, I've failed. I'm hurting, instead of, I'm broken. Once you extend that grace inward, you no longer need to weaponize it outward. This doesn't mean you should accept everyone's behavior or stay in the line of emotional fire. Healthy understanding comes with boundaries. Some people project so loudly that their judgment will drown you if you let it. The work isn't to absorb it, it's to recognize what belongs to them and what belongs to you. The moment you stop taking someone's criticism personally, you begin to see their wounds instead of their weapons. That's how healing begins, not in control, but in clarity. Judgment dissolves when curiosity takes its place. When you look at someone and think, what must it feel like to carry that much fear? Instead of, what's wrong with them? You reclaim your peace. That's the transformation Jung spoke of, integrating the shadow instead of fighting it. Because the world doesn't need more judges, it needs witnesses, people willing to see without condemning, to understand without surrendering their truth. You cannot heal what you keep judging, not in others, not in yourself. But once you choose understanding, you break the cycle. You stop repeating the pain that built you. You stop defending and start seeing. And that is how freedom quietly begins, not with an apology, but with awareness. Because when understanding becomes your default, judgment loses its power. And what remains isn't weakness, it's wisdom. The kind that allows you to walk through a flawed world and still see its humanity. There's a kind of power that doesn't need to raise its voice. It doesn't argue, it doesn't correct, it doesn't seek to win. It simply sees clearly, deeply, without distortion. This is the power that comes when you stop judging, when you no longer need to label every action as good or bad, every person as right or wrong. You begin to see the truth beneath it all, that everyone is fighting a silent battle, and most are just trying to survive it with whatever tools they were given. You notice it first in small moments. A friend interrupts you, and instead of feeling the spark of irritation, you sense their anxiety, the way they rush to fill silence, because they're afraid of being unseen. A stranger snaps at you in traffic, and instead of snapping back, you catch the flicker of desperation in their voice, the residue of a day that's already broken them. Seeing without condemning isn't passivity, it's mastery. It's emotional alchemy, the ability to turn judgment into understanding without losing your boundaries in the process. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "When someone does you wrong, it is because they believe it right." That's the tragedy and the beauty of human nature. We act according to what we think will protect us, even when it harms others. To recognize this doesn't mean you excuse the behavior, it means you understand it, and therefore you're no longer chained to it. The moment you stop judging, you reclaim your energy from the endless need to be right. You begin to live, not react. Carl Jung called this integration the moment you see your own shadow and no longer flinch. You realize that the same capacity for cruelty, pride, and fear lives within you too. It's humbling, almost painful at first, but with that humility comes freedom. Because once you accept that you are no different, you stop needing to divide the world into monsters and saints. You understand that all of us are both depending on the day, the wound, the circumstance. Psychologically, this is the birth of what Brené Brown calls wholeheartedness, living without armor. It doesn't mean blindness to injustice, but a clarity that doesn't consume you. It's the quiet confidence that you can see people's flaws and still choose peace. Neuroscientists say that compassion activates the same neural circuits as joy. To understand, then, is not to lose power, but to awaken it, to step beyond ego into something larger, calmer, infinitely more alive. Imagine this: two people in conversation. One finally listens without defending, the other finally speaks without fear. The air between them softens, and something ancient in both of them exhales. That is the moment judgment dies, and love, in its truest form, begins. Because in the end, we stop judging when we finally understand how fragile we all are, how much of what we call strength is just a different shape of pain. And maybe wisdom isn't about seeing who's right or wrong, but about seeing clearly and still choosing to stay kind.